since I've got this here, let me digress on this for a moment. Here is a symbol. It's so mundane and so ordinary that everyday people look at it and never think about it at all. But here's a symbol that represents the 12 months of the year, but the 12 ages of the great year, the cycle. The from Aries, Taurus, Cancer, Gemini, Leo, Virgo, Libra, etc., all the way through the 12. You think of this as a symbol for the cosmic clock. Now, one of the things that I've been very interested in for many years is the great cycles of change. You see, we've grown up in a milieu, a scientific milieu, where we were basically taught that everything happens gradually, uniformly. And this is in marked contrast to the ancient concepts of time, who didn't see concept as a smooth linear continuum, but as a cyclic recurrence. And that within those cycles, there were, if we want to use more modern terminology, points of discontinuity. Within those points of discontinuity, change that was compressed, that was orders of magnitude beyond in tempo of the normal rates of everyday change, right? Now, in the work that I've been doing, I've been documenting, along with my colleague back there, Brad, we've been documenting the imprint in the Earth itself of these points of discontinuity, where something has happened, something on another level altogether, right? Timothy, you're from Buffalo, and right up there you see Niagara Falls, thank you. For example, one of the things that I show in one of my programs is extinct cataracts. You know, Horseshoe Falls is a cataract, right? I show images of extinct cataracts that utterly dwarf Niagara, that carried several thousand times more water than Niagara carries, right? Now, most of the human population on Earth today does not understand that the history of this planet has been punctuated by these events that are so outsized and so extraordinary. And the scale of the phenomena that they have left imprinted into the Earth is so vast that we have not been able to see it until within the last couple of decades. In fact, there was a man named J. Harlan Bretz who back in the 1920s and 30s traveled around in Washington State, Idaho, and Oregon documenting evidence for this gigantic flood. And it took him 25 years to create a map of the geomorphic effects of this gigantic flood. And I mean a gigantic flood. A flood big enough that if one stream, say, were to sweep through here in the region of Atlanta, once the flood had declined, there would be no Atlanta. It would be erased completely. It took him 25 years to make a map of these features that anybody now can see in 5 to 10 seconds. Because we now have satellite imagery. We have Google Earth, right? So back in Bretz's day, 3, 4, 5 generations ago, humans were not able to access this other level of perception that we now can. And one of the ideas that I'm trying to get out there and build the case for is this, that inscribed into the earth itself is a message, a story, in great detail. And it has been laying there for 12,000 years. 12,000 years waiting until humans had evolved the sensory apparatus to perceive it. Within the last decade or two, we have achieved that level. But at this point, 99.999% of human beings on Earth are completely oblivious to the fact that they're walking around on top of a gigantic textbook, a gigantic manuscript etched into the surface of the Earth itself. And it's there. And anybody who wants to challenge me on it, I welcome it, because I can show it to them unequivocally that it's there, waiting for us to decipher. The time has now come that the human race is going to understand that the surface of this earth has written into it, inscribed within the rock itself, a message from the cosmos. And when we perceive that message, it's going to transform our species. There's no doubt it's going to happen. If we have a future on this planet, it will have to happen. And it is the very secret of the Grail itself. See, because the Grail is about restoring the wasteland in the aftermath of one of these events, one of these discontinuous events, one of these event nodes in the history of the planet. That's what the Grail is about. Go back to the first books of Genesis. After Adam and Eve had been created and they were set down in the garden, what were they instructed to do? 4 things. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? Be fruitful and multiply. Well, what does that mean? Well, see, up until now, we've not had a context for making sense out of that. What we now know, though, is that between 11 and 13,000 years ago, the human population came within a hair's breadth of becoming extinct. It's now well documented that all over the planet, simultaneously, the evidence of human occupation just suddenly ceased. There were rock quarries that had been quarried actively for generations, and suddenly all activity stopped. There were artifacts within the archaeological record, spear points, arrowheads, toolkits. All of a sudden it stops. Radiocarbon dating of human activity, of communities, of campsites, of places where people congregated and lived for generations, leaving in the archaeological record, in the rock record, the evidence in the form of radiocarbon datable organic material. And it all stops suddenly. All these things are happening suddenly. And over this layer, over these events, is a black layer that has been referred to as the black mat. Below that black mat, you also find the bones of gigantic extinct species of animals that inhabited the earth for hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, giant camels, giant beavers, giant armadillos, on and on. 120 or more species of animals, prolific around the planet. Their remains are found up, and they disappear at the same time as the human artifacts disappear. And capping the whole thing is this black mat layer. And why is it black? It's black because it contains a lot of carbonaceous material. And what is the source of that carbonaceous material? Soot. And at the bottom of that black mat layer, what are the scientists finding? Since 2007, key year, what they're finding is hexagonal nanodiamonds that can only be created under intense, unbelievably powerful regimes of pressure and heat. They're finding magnetic grains. They're finding microspherules. They're finding Buckminster fullerenes, which are these soccer ball-shaped molecules. They're finding spikes of the platinum group metals, osmium, iridium. If you know the story of the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, which is where the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago, everybody by now knows that the almost certain cause of their disappearance from the Earth was something from space.
Didn't they find a big depression down in the Gulf of Mexico?
They sure did. Yes, they sure did. 130 miles at least in diameter, and it's buried under a half a mile of limestone. How did they first get the clue that there was something cosmic that was involved? In a place called Gubbio, Italy, they were looking at a little layer. They called it the magic layer. And in that magic layer, they found that iridium, one of the platinum group metals, was many times more abundant than you normally find in the crust of the earth, because it's not found in the crust of the earth. Iridium is a siderophile, which means it loves iron. So in the early days of planetary formation, when the heavy iron sunk to the core, it took all the iridium with it and left the Earth's crust deficient in iridium. But where do we now find iridium abundant? Asteroids, meteors, things from space. So it was this signature, this fingerprint of the iridium that first provided the clue. Now guess what? They found at the bottom of the black mat layer, iridium, osmium, right? So here, a mere 12, actually, and here's what to me is so astounding. The date of this event, 12,900 years ago. Well, given that each astrological month on average is 2,160 years, exactly half a cycle is a whole cycle is 25,920 years. That's the full precessional cycle for the Earth to go through one complete sequence of the great year, right? Half of that cycle, think of the line representing the line connecting Aquarius at one end to Leo at the other end. Half of that cycle is 12,960 years. The dating of this event is now being given 12,900 plus or minus 100 years. Now I knew this date 25 years ago, and I learned it from my immersion into the archaic traditions. So it's very gratifying to me to see this date now emerging. I gave lectures in Warren Wilson College in 1996 where I repeatedly said, look at the date 13,000 years ago, 12,900 years ago, because that was a date that something very profound happened on this planet. And now the evidence is emerging and being scientifically confirmed. So what happened? The planet was rendered a wasteland. And from that wasteland, planet Earth had to recover. Now, what we see happening is that prior to this event, Earth was locked in the grip of a deep ice age. Now, what does that imply? Well, where you lived, Timothy, been 2,000 feet of ice over your head, right? 2,000 feet. There was an ice sheet that reached from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and from the northern United States up to the Arctic Circle, and it was up to 2 miles thick. There were no Great Lakes because they were buried under thousands of feet of ice. Detroit, New York, Boston, Twin Cities, Seattle, Montreal, all of the cities in Canada buried under ice. And it was also over northwestern Europe as well. When all that ice accumulated, it dropped sea levels by 400 feet. As sea levels dropped, coastlines migrated seaward, right? 400 feet. Can you imagine what, there's concern now, sea levels are going to rise 2.5 feet in the next century. Well, what would it mean if the sea levels rose or dropped 400 feet? Which they did between 11 and 13,000 years ago. So sea levels migrated, right? So here in Georgia, if you suddenly found yourself transported back 13,000, 14, 15, 16,000 years ago, if you wanted to go swimming at the beach, if you went out now to the Cumberland or St. Simons or any of the areas along the beach, you'd be standing in the middle of a northern, what's called boreal forest, like you now find up in Canada. And roaming around in that boreal forest would be herds of mastodons, giant lions the size of horses, the giant short-faced bear whose shoulders stood 6 feet off the ground, that weighed up to a half a ton to 1,500 pounds. Probably the greatest predator of the Ice Age. Off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, you would oftentimes see fleets of great icebergs floating by. It was a vastly, vastly different world. And somewhere between 11 and 13,000 years ago, it was as if some cosmic hand flipped a switch and altered the whole balance of nature on planet Earth. And in the aftermath, there were large, large areas of the Earth that were basically rendered uninhabitable for a while. Imagine the devastation of a Mount St. Helens, but on a planetary scale. Brad and I had the opportunity in October to go visit. I've always wanted to go see Mount St. Helens. Was my first time there, and it was very interesting to see the recovery in the aftermath of catastrophe. And it's quite phenomenal how quickly nature is recovering. But you see, coming out of the depths of that great ice age, it's interesting. Here we had the cold of the ice age, which according to some estimates was as much as 15 degrees colder than now, on average, right? So here in Georgia, even in areas like Kentucky, was tundra. And we're not talking millions of years ago, we're talking, 12 to 15 to 18,000 years ago, see? Okay, now overnight, in a geological sense, the whole balance of nature shifted. The ice rapidly melted away. It melted away so fast that scientists have not been able to explain where the energy came to melt it so fast. They first realized in the early 1970s, when radiocarbon dating, came along in the 1950s. Prior to radiocarbon dating, they assumed that the ice age had gone in this long unbroken for 100, maybe 200,000 years, right? When radiocarbon dating came along, and they started looking at the dates now, they realized some very sobering things. One of the things they realized was that 26 to 40,000 years ago, there were forests growing under vast regions that were buried under ice 18 to 20,000 years ago. And what is interesting is it appears that the ice rapidly came back around 26,000 years ago and rapidly grew so that 18 to 20,000 years ago, it now swallowed up more than half the North American continent. It was as if the South Pole was set right over Canada, literally, because the only modern analog to that environment of 15,000 years ago in North America is the South Pole, right? You had a polar climate. Now, within a matter of a few thousand years, that polar climate shifted and all of that ice melted away. But see, it takes energy to convert ice into water. So in the early 1970s, the scientists, the climate scientists back then were looking at this evidence and they realized something. They said, well, it wasn't 100,000 or 200,000 years that this was there and then slowly disappeared. It came on overnight and it disappeared overnight. Just like that. Boom, it was gone. Now, they then looked at, okay, if we allow 5,000 or 6,000 years for the disappearance of that ice, and they went out and they started tracking because they could see where the ice receded, and then receded a little more, then receded more. And in 5,000 years, it's all gone. So they took, okay, if we start, like in the northern United States, or they went up to the borderline of the Yukon and Alaska, where the northwestern edge of the ice sheet was. And they realized that in order to get rid of that ice in 5,000 years, you had to have the margin of that ice had to recede on average 800 to 900 feet every year. 800 to 900 feet, right? Now that's assuming a smooth linear recession of the ice over the whole period of time. They then looked and they figured, okay, how much energy would it take to melt the ice that quick? And they came up with this number, 360 kilocalories, which is 360,000 calories of energy applied every square centimeter per year. Well, let's put that into context. What does that mean? Well, they then started saying, well, let's compare that to modern environments and look at how much incident solar radiation, solar energy is available. They started looking at different environments. They looked at the present environment of Canada. Gets really cold in the winter, right? Gets really cold up in Buffalo. But come spring, that snow melts away. It doesn't stay there and accumulate and build up to 2 miles thick of glacial ice, does it? But that's what happened 26,000 years ago, see? So you've got this rapid accumulation of ice, the rapid melting away of the ice, and so now they calculated and they looked at different environments around the Earth, and they looked at African deserts. And they realized that the amount of available energy in an African desert was 200 kilocalories per square centimeter per year. But the amount of energy needed to melt the ice as quick as it melted was 360 kilocalories per square centimeter per year. So now think about this. The amount of energy available from an African desert turned onto the ice sheet for 5,000 years is what it would take to melt that ice that quick. Where in the hell did that much energy come from? They gave up. They said, there's something we've missed in the data. We're going to put this on the shelf and we'll get back to it. To this day, they haven't gotten back to it. They called it the energy paradox. And it is indeed a paradox. Now, of course, what they weren't taking into account, they were trying to think of a model. How do you apply that much energy smoothly over 5,000 years? Well, it wasn't energy applied smoothly over 5,000 years. It was pulses of energy, concentrated, where the total of the energy was the same. But rather than smoothly, uniform over 5,000 years, it was pulses. Instantaneous pulses of energy introduced into the system. And the result of that was massive catastrophic meltdown and literal tsunamis of meltwater gushing off the ice sheet, sweeping over the land, washing away everything in its path, stripping out bedrock sometimes 1,000 feet deep in a week or two. The world that pre-existed these events, when they were over, that world was gone. And that's the world that Graham Hancock has been writing about and studying for the last 25 or 30 years. And I had the opportunity in October, Brad and I acted as Graham's guide for he's writing a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. I don't know how many of you have read Fingerprints of the Gods. Yes, he's writing a sequel to that, where he's now getting into understanding that, yes, there really was a catastrophe. And when you understand the magnitude of that catastrophe, you clearly understand why there is no abundant evidence anywhere for what pre-existed. See, this is part of one of the great insights, the sobering insights, that the human species has to come to terms with. If we're going to grow up spiritually and psychologically, we have to realize that our ancestors experienced these events. And the memory of these events, the trauma of these events, is embedded in our very consciousness and is driving a lot of the things that we do today. But coming out of that event, after the dust settled, after the ice was gone, the sea levels had come up and stabilized the coastlines, this is when we see now human population hovering on the verge of extinction. We came very, very close. Now, back to the biblical admonition, be fruitful and multiply. Well, anytime you have a species hovering on the verge of extinction, what's the most important thing that you can do? Think of the American bison. It was down, turn of the century, it's down to what, 50 or 100 individual bison, right? Now there's so many bison, not as many as there was at the peak of bison, 300 years ago, when there were millions of them roaming the Great Prairies, but there's enough of them that we can go into the Kroger store and buy bison burger, right? Well, of course, the numbers of individual bisons are being contained through bison farming. Were we to just open the gates and let them run freely, they would already have recovered, probably be 1 million strong. Give another 10, 20, 30 years, there'd be millions of them. Somebody looking back 10,000 years in the future probably wouldn't even notice that particular species came within a hair's breadth of going extinct. And for that very same idea is why we have not understood that we ourselves came that close to extinction. But just like with the bison, when its numbers are reduced to 50, what's the most important thing that they can do is be fruitful and multiply. And that's exactly the injunction placed upon the human species, at least as represented in the Bible. Be fruitful and multiply. But what was the other two injunctions? Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. Replenish. Not plenish the earth, replenish it. And I don't know how that wording has so many people have overlooked the implications of that wording. That they're there to replenish the earth. Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth. The final one is subdue it, which has also been misconstrued to mean that we have complete license to trample nature however we want. That's not what it means. We'll get, at some point in our series here, we can get into the original Hebrew of what that means.
There are two versions of that, and the later one says more, take care of the earth.
Take care of the earth, sure, exactly. To be stewards of the earth. But what we have to understand in all of this discussions now, and the politicization of the discussions of climate change, is why I get frustrated with it, is because there's an attempt to limit the entire discussion to the anthropogenic effect of climate change, the human, ignoring the natural. See, because if we now look back in the record, going back hundreds of thousands of years, we're going to see that the climate of this planet has been extraordinarily dynamic. I mean, think about this. We do not have an explanation for what drives the planet into an ice age and back out of an ice age. So, not knowing that, how in the world can we say that the debate on climate change is all over and that there's now a consensus on what drives climate change? Don't fall for that. Don't, because it's a politically driven, it's science in the service of a political agenda. And that's not to say that there's not some good science coming out of the IPCC, because there is. But at the same time, it's also being subordinated to a political agenda. That's why the average person does not see the body of research. All they see is the summary of the summary for policymakers, which is written by bureaucrats who cherry pick the findings of the IPCC in order to further this agenda of basically control. Because the outset of that, the objective is basically the control of the production, the distribution, and the consumption of energy. And if you've got control of that, you've got control of everything that humans do. But the problem with that is that we're ignoring the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the natural dynamic climate. And if we ignore that, we're putting ourselves in peril. We really are. And so, in the aftermath of this catastrophe is when we find, stepping onto the world stage, the goddess. Right? During this period of the Neolithic, 6,000 to 9,000 years ago, in the aftermath of the great upheavals that ended the Ice Age, the planet went into a period of very benign warmth for 3,000 or more years, in which the climate was, in some places, estimated to be 2 to 4 degrees warmer than now. There are places where in mountain ranges, tree levels were 1,500 feet higher than now, right? There was abundant rainfall. There was, and I'm writing about this in the series that Sherry is publishing in the Oracle. So read those if you haven't, right? I've written like 3 or 4 articles now on this period, the age of the goddess, when humans, the descendants of the survivors, are worshiping the earth in the form of a corpulent pregnant goddess. And it's during this period when it's basically, the northern hemisphere is Garden of Eden-like. When there was a long growing season, there was abundant warmth, and the human population rapidly expanded. Then, this was at the end of the age of Leo and going into the age of Gemini. Come forward to the age of Taurus. We're talking about 6,000 years ago. Climate shifts again. The climatologists refer to it as the neoglaciation. What happened during the neoglaciation? The climate cooled. The glaciers began to grow after contracting, in some cases almost disappearing completely during the Neolithic. The glaciers began to grow again. But bear in mind that during the Neolithic, people were living, it was very easy at that time to live a hunter-gatherer existence, because for one thing, the top of the predatory food chain has been decapitated. And now what you have is that frees up all of the small game to rapidly proliferate. The warm climate and the abundant rainfall encouraged the prolific growth of vegetation. And so it was very easy for isolated bands of survivors to rapidly reproduce, to live a comfortable existence, to essentially reach out their hand and pluck the fruit from the tree, right? But then the neoglaciation came along about 6,000 years ago, during the age of Taurus, right? One of those quadrants on our great wheel. The climate began to cool. Now, you had communities of people living and farming at 10,000 feet. They got frozen out. Now, during that 3,000 years, here's isolated pockets of survivors. For 3,000 years, they're expanding. Human population is rebounding, right? You've got settled communities, settled patterns, settled lifeway patterns. And now suddenly the climate cools and disrupts the whole thing. And it's interesting that if you've ever familiar with the work of Maria Gimbutas, the anthropologist, archaeologist, who's done extensive studies and excavation on the Neolithic period, who named it the civilization of the goddess during this time. She reports, and it's in my next article, it'll be coming out. I've got quotes from her where she's saying that nowhere in that 3,000 to 4,000 year period is there any implements of warfare, of human conflict. It's absent, conspicuously absent. Now, the neoglaciation comes on, and what follows in its wake? Conflict. See? Now, let's get back to conclude this. What am I saying is the Grail? It's a lost technology for the regeneration, the replenishment of both Earth and humankind in the aftermath of a catastrophe. It's how to bring the planet back to vitality, fecundity, fertility, how to accelerate that process. And I think that's the science that has been conveyed down through the generations in multiple forms to get to us now. Because we can use that science. We can, by understanding that science, we will have a roadmap to a potential future that could be beyond anything we can imagine right now. You see, we are really truly in our emergence of a global civilization at a point of bifurcation. You see, we can go two different routes here, right? One of those routes is going to lead to tyranny and authoritarianism. The other route is going to unleash the human spirit of freedom and creativity. Now, which way it's going to go could come down to the balance might be very, very delicate. It may not take much to tip it one way or the other. But there are factions. Remember, black magic? He had to learn the ABCs, but without the use of black magic. Just to use that as a metaphor, there are those who are committed to dominion over their fellow man, who are committed to control. And right now, they occupy the instruments of power. Until enough people wake up and go, okay, your reign is over. You had your chance, it didn't work, goodbye. It's time to restore freedom to this planet. And I think that the next big thing for the generation coming up behind us is the complete abolition of war from this planet once and for all. Be done with it. We don't need it anymore. We are a global community of human beings, and we don't need war anymore because we can now understand what the source of human conflict was originally, and we can purge ourselves of those traumas and grow beyond it spiritually. And that's the message in the story that has to go out from this point on. And that if we don't, nature's going to have some surprises for us. As sure as we are sitting here tonight, nature will rectify the imbalances. Hey, it's Randall here. If you've enjoyed this and want more, I have a lot more in store for you. If you click the link below, you'll get some exclusive material that I'll be releasing over the next several weeks. I think it will really help you make sense out of our hidden past. This is stuff you won't find anywhere else. And the only way to get it is to click the link below and let me know that you want to stay in the loop. Okay. That's all for now. See you soon.